Hello and welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. Today I'm all alone because normally I interview somebody who was down the rabbit hole, is down the rabbit hole, or knows somebody down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. But last weekend I went down a rabbit hole of my own. I visited a flat earth conference. In fact, I was a featured speaker. In fact, I was actually the headliner in a way at this Flat Earth Conference. The Flat Earth Conference was called the Exit the Matrix Expo, and it was in Las Vegas at the Plaza Hotel on May the, I think, 26th and 27th, the Saturday and the Sunday. The way it came about was kind of interesting. But before I get into that, the reason I'm not having someone on to interview this week is that I talked to a lot of people at this conference. And I didn't record them because I didn't want to intimidate people, because people who believe in the flat earth and other conspiracy theories that are fairly extreme are often very suspicious of people who don't believe in those theories. So I talked to them and I tried to remember as best as I could what happened, and this is going to be my impressions of what happened at that conference and my explanation of what I did, how it came to pass, and what I learned from it. I also hope to follow up with a number of the people that I met, get them on the podcast and interview them. So it's good to have this baseline of what my perception is before I interview these other people, and hopefully they'll be in the next week or two, at least one. Okay, so the Flat Earth Expo, called Exit the Matrix, and it was organized by ostensibly Mad Mike Hughes. I have this t-shirt here, Mad Mike Hughes. Mad Mike Hughes is a Las Vegas personality, I guess, who is famous for launching a rocket to try to see if the Earth is curved. Now, his first rocket was essentially just a publicity stunt. He only went up, I think, like 1,000 feet or less, like maybe 600 feet, and it was a steam-powered rocket. So obviously it wasn't going to go into space. But he's been a kind of a member of the flat earth community for a while, but kind of on the fringe, because people aren't really sure if he believes the earth is flat. And I personally don't really think he really thinks it's flat, but he's obviously open to the idea. Because of this kind of equivocation, he is a bit on the outside of the flat earth community. And I think he was a bit annoyed at getting less attention from other flat earth people when he announced his second rocket launch, which is supposed to take him to the edge of space. And so he decided to organize his own conference. And he's teamed up with a guy who's helped him before, who goes by a number of names, one of which is Infinite Plane Society. He's probably most well known for his YouTube channel, where he broadcasts these long conversations that he has with people about I guess you would call them false flags or fake events. He thinks everything is fake, basically, or he assumes everything is fake until proven otherwise. So if something happens, like someone gets shot, he will assume that shooting has been faked. So Infinite Plane Society and Mad Mike are setting up this conference. Now, it really seems to be mostly organized by Infinite Plane Society, who goes by a number of names, one of which is Tim Osman, which is the guy I interviewed like a week or so ago. And Tim Osman is the name supposedly of the CIA agent who was pretending to be Osama bin Laden. It's part of a grander conspiracy theory. So using the name Tim Osman is kind of a signaling device to show that you're being ironic about reality, I guess, and that you think that everything is fake, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Tim Osman, IPS, and Mad Mike Hughes are setting up this conference. And what happened was IPS contacted me via email and asked if I would like to be on his show, essentially his podcast, his YouTube channel, to talk about chemtrails, because he doesn't think that chemtrails are real, which is, kind of odd. If you think people believe that the Earth is flat, then why not believe in other theories like chemtrails? But one of the things I learned over the weekend was that quite a few people don't actually think that chemtrails are real, and yet they still think that the Earth is flat, which is rather strange. So I agreed to go on IPS's show, and I talked about chemtrails for a while, and then after that, he asked if I would like to give a speech at the Flat Earth Conference. And I said, sure, yeah, if you pay for my airfare and my hotel. And he agreed to that. And then he said, would I like to debate? And I said, yeah, that'd be fine. I didn't know who I was debating at the time, but I'm always up for a discussion, a debate. And he told me later it would be this guy, Nathan Thompson, who is a guy who runs a very popular Flat Earth group on Facebook. Nathan Thompson is kind of a biblical flat earther in a way. He uses some biblical explanations, but he also likes to throw out lots and lots of scientific sounding explanations, which generally aren't very good, but he's got a long list of them, so it's actually kind of gets hard to address because there's so many of them. But I did address, as I shall discuss that later. So I agreed to this. I was very suspicious, of course, because a bunch of people who believe in the flat Earth are inviting me to Las Vegas for some conference that no one's ever heard of. There was no publicity or anything at the time, and my suspicions were removed somewhat when he actually sent me some money to cover my airfare. I told him how much the airfare would be. He sent me money. I booked the flight. He sent me some more money to cover the cost of the hotel, and he booked the hotel for me. So that was all fine. I'm not going to be out of pocket. It would be an interesting 3 days, 2 or 3 days in Vegas. So that's how it all came about. As the day got closer, as the time got closer, there really wasn't very much publicity about this Flat Earth conference. And I was kind of surprised at this because he's already spent $1,000 on me for my hotel room and my flight. And yet they didn't really seem to be publicizing it at all, which was strange. And I was vaguely suspicious about what was going on. But obviously, if they spent the money to get me over there, it seemed legit. Then eventually there was some publicity, but it was always in just fairly obscure corners and flat Earth groups and in IPS's Tim Osman's site. And so it was a bit odd that there really wasn't more publicity. So I wasn't really expecting very many people to be there. And as it happens, that played out. But that's jumping ahead. So I flew out there on the Friday, and I took my infrared camera with me, my Nikon P900, which is being converted to infrared. And I used that to take a bunch of photographs out of the window, try to detect the curve of the Earth. But it was too cloudy, unfortunately, for me to get any good photos. But it's the type of thing I like to do when I'm on a plane. When I arrived, I checked into the hotel, and there was a bit of confusion because there was a different name on the reservation. And obviously, I didn't actually know what the real name of IPS is. What is Tim Osman's real name? He goes by a whole bunch of different names. I didn't know what was real. I didn't know what to do. And so there was it took me about 15 minutes to actually check in whilst they tried to track down who this guy actually was, whose name was on the reservation and whose credit card it was. And actually, we got in touch with him. I think he was driving at the time, and then it was all confirmed and it was all sorted out. So, that wasn't a problem. It was just a confusion over names and him using an alias with me, I guess, and probably his real name with the hotel because he had to use his credit card. So I checked in, and then I went to get something to eat, and I met Mad Mike Hughes. Mad Mike is the rocket guy who's trying to get to the edge of space in a rocket. He is 63 years old. He said this a few times, and he's a smaller guy, which is pretty handy for fitting into small rockets. And he seemed very nice, very pleasant, very polite, and he talked about how he appreciated me being there and how he thought it would be good to have polite discourse. And he said he thought this would be the last flat Earth debate that was ever needed, which I thought was something of an overreach, because obviously there's been lots of flat Earth debates. I am nothing special here. So I didn't really think that was an accurate characterization. He was there with another guy called Mike, also called Mike, from an organization which is basically him, called Exploring Again, which is about him trying to explore Antarctica, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So that's pretty much all I have on the Friday. Next day, Saturday, was the day that I was set to give a talk, and various other people, including Nathan Thompson, my debate opponent, was also set to give a talk. So in the morning, I made my way down to the conference hall, which was way in the back. down this long empty corridor, and it was in this reasonable sized room. It had, I think, about 160 seats in it. There was nobody there when I arrived, which was about, I guess, 8:45 or maybe 8:30. I was thinking I'd get there early because it was going to start at 9. As it happened, it didn't really start until 10, and there really weren't very many people there. So I talked to the people who were there, people who were setting up in the outside room where there were some tables. The first guy I talked to, I met in the elevator on the way down. I got in, he got in after me, and there's this kind of wild bearded guy, looks a bit like Rasputin might look, and he looked at me and went, "Mick West." And I went, "Yeah?" And he was, "I can help you." And I was like, oh, okay. Brother Ernest, because I recognized him. He was a guy called Brother Ernest, a kind of religious guy who believed the earth is actually concave, like we live on the inside of the earth. And he said, "Yes, talk to me later. I can help you with Nathan." Which was a bit odd at the time, but it turned out that Brother Ernest was actually a very nice guy, and he just wanted to give me a few pointers later about my debate with Nathan. Because I didn't know anybody at this point, I was a little bit nervous, and it seemed a bit strange. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It was all fine. I got into the hall, and no one was there in the audience yet. And the first person I talked to was Dave Gordon, who is one of the sponsors of this expo. He is a guy who has invented a camping stove of a sort, which uses a kind of a drafting technique to draw air up through a chimney, and gives less smoke and more even heating, and he has a patent, and he was selling this. What this has to do with flat Earth, I have no idea. However, I think he is a flat earther, and he wanted to go to the conference, and he saw the opportunity to try to promote his business, which is selling these stoves, and so he said, he sponsored the conference to a degree. I don't know to what degree. And he was showing off his little camping stove, which was, it was a nice little stove. Obviously it worked, but I don't know. Nothing to do with flat Earth. The next person I talked to did have a lot to do with flat Earth. His name was Chris Pontius. Chris Pontius. He is a model maker, and he makes these lovely little models, and some quite large models, of the flat Earth map. And he has a round flat Earth disk with a map on it, and it has a dome over it, a plastic dome, and it has stars on it, and some of them have little suns and moons that go around on like clock handles. Quite pretty things. He also was selling orgonite, which is kind of these pretty paperweight type things, which are made from various types of metal and crystals embedded in a type of acrylic, clear acrylic. So it's type of thing sometimes kids do, is they make paperweights out of acrylic and pouring stuff in. But these are very pretty ones, and they're supposed to have a very specific way of gathering energy, orgone energy from the atmosphere. And he also has some that was a combination of two. It was an orgone base with a flat Earth map on top, and he said that there was something, there was some kind of orgonite field that helped something. I'm not sure exactly what. Anyway, he was a nice guy. In fact, most people there were nice people, guys and women. The next person I talked to, let's see, was Russ. Russ, I don't remember his full name. I can put that in the notes. But Russ ran something, I think it's called the Flat Earth Media Group, and he's trying to set up all kinds of like competitor to YouTube for people to put their Flat Earth videos on, and doing Flat Earth radio shows and resources for Flat Earth photos and things like that. He seemed quite nice, although at some point he started talking about how terrible it was in Europe with all the immigrants coming in, which to me sounded a little bit maybe like he didn't like Muslims. I'm sure he would just say, he didn't like the changing culture, or it wasn't being done right, or there's all these problems with radicalization. And I talked a bit about my upbringing near Bradford, which has a big Muslim population, back in the 70s, and how there wasn't really any more problems than you would expect from various diverse cultures blending together. But he was very polite. Okay, and so then The conference got started, I think, around 10 or 11, and Russ started it off, and there was another woman there called Shelley who runs some kind of flat earth radio. I think it's called Down the Rabbit Hole, which is kind of interesting because I have a book called Escaping the Rabbit Hole, and of course this podcast is called Tales from the Rabbit Hole. So I was very much in the rabbit hole at that moment. And Russ and Shelley basically kind of interviewed each other at that point. There was some other talks from some of the other people there. Chris Pontius got up and gave a short talk, but he wasn't really into talking. And then there was a much longer talk from Mad Mike Hughes, the rocket man, and his rocket scientist, who's the guy who actually builds the rockets for him. Now, the rocket scientist is called Waldo. Waldo something again. Yeah, sorry, I space out on these second names. Waldo doesn't really seem to think that the Earth is flat, and he mentioned several times things like going to the moon and rockets going into space. So he didn't really seem like he fit in, but he kept trying to say things like, when we went to the moon, if we actually did. But you could tell he really actually thought we went to the moon, or at least assumed that was true. He gave a kind of a presentation basically explaining some things about the rockets that Mad Mike was going to use, and it was all a bit chaotic because he didn't use the microphone, and his wife got up there and she was holding the microphone in his face, and he was trying to give a slideshow, but all he had was his little laptop, and so he was pointing at things on his laptop, but people were sat at the back of the room so they couldn't see or hear because he wasn't using the microphone. But you got the general idea that he's building a rocket, and he's done a bunch of fun tests out in the desert, and that he plans to take Mike into space. My talk was basically trying to get people to look at the flat Earth problem in different ways. People often give these different lists of proofs. This is a proof of this, proof of that. But I try to get people to look at the way there are different models of the world, and you need to understand which model you're using, whether it's just simplification or a more accurate model or a super accurate complex model. And I gave examples like gravity. Gravity can be looked at in three ways. It can be just a force that goes straight down towards the ground, or it can be a force between two objects like two planets or a planet and you, which means it goes towards the center of the Earth, or it can be this Einstein's bending of space-time, special relativity, general relativity, and you've got to understand which model you're using. So I gave this long talk, and I gave a bunch of examples, and I gave a few examples of experiments that I thought that were not answered by the flat Earth model. I gave a long spiel about how latitude and longitude don't actually work. Australia on the flat Earth map gets really stretched out, and if you try to compress it so it works better, then the latitude and longitude lines don't line up. So I gave all these things. Some of these things I would have expected them to be familiar with, but it seemed like a lot of the time the things I was saying weren't really getting across. I tried to explain one thing where you could see one mountain was below another when you'd expect it to be above the other. And I don't really think that got across to people in the audience. I talked to people afterwards, and no one even kind of brought it up. They basically just kind of ignored a lot of my points and stayed with their own points. Now, just before this talk, I met Nathan Thompson, who is my debate opponent, who was going to give a talk after me. And I gave him a crystal, a prism, a little triangular prism, the type you use to split light into a rainbow. And I gave it to him, and I told him that you can use it to verify whether light is being bent up by what colors you see on the edge of things. I told him it was to do with the green flash. I didn't really have much time to get into details with him, but I gave it to him. And then in my talk, I got the crystal out, got the prism out, and I used it to demonstrate this effect. The reason I did this was Nathan has a proof of the flat Earth where he looks at the setting sun, and he sees that at the top of the setting sun there's sometimes a little green flash. This is quite a famous type thing. You can look it up, green flash, setting sun. And he rationalized that because green light is bent down more than red light, this meant that the sun was actually higher than it appears, meaning it was actually above the horizon. Now, when he made this argument, which he's made several times before, when he made the argument, I saw it on the video, I recognized he got it backwards. In fact, when something is bent down, when light is bent down, it raises up the image. So the more the light is bent, the higher the image is raised. And so you get this little green flash above the image, which means the light is being bent down, which means the image is being raised up, which means that the sun is actually below the horizon. So what he had put out as a proof of the flat Earth was actually, if you use his reasoning, a proof of the globe Earth. And I thought this was a very interesting thing to show to him. And I didn't want to just entirely, surprise him with this. So before my speech, I gave him the prism and briefly told him what it was about. Then in my speech, I got it out and I actually kind of tried to demonstrate it. You can't really demonstrate it because you actually have to look through it, but I showed how to do it. I held up the prism, I held up a glowing ping pong ball light that I used to simulate the sun, and I explained, hold it like this and you will see that it's green on the top, which means that the sun is below the horizon, which means that the Earth is a globe. Doesn't matter if you don't follow the logic of this argument, because most people there didn't either. Just, it is an argument. It is actually a valid argument. And so at the end of my speech, Nathan got up to give his speech, his presentation, and he gave his presentation, and he reiterated a lot of the usual points that he made, and I made loads and loads of notes about what all these points were so I could bring them up again in the debate the next day. And right at the end, he got an audience member to come up and look through the prism, but he held it upside down, which meant the light was being bent up, and so the woman said, oh, it's red on top this time, which it would be because he's doing it upside down. And I tried to explain this to him afterwards, but yeah, it became clearer the next day. I'll get into this more later. So we gave our speeches, and then there were some other people giving speeches afterwards. I say speeches, but it's really a presentation. And then I went outside. I think maybe it was like the rocket stove guy was giving a talk, which I wasn't really that interested in, or somebody was giving a talk which wasn't that interesting. I went outside and I talked to some other people outside. I had a really long and very productive conversation with a guy called Joe. Joe just basically said hi to me in the hallway outside the conference. And I just asked him what he was doing there and why he thinks the Earth is flat. And he just, basically we started discussing various things. And he would say things like, you can see across a lake, you can see a laser across a lake. And I explained to him why that is, because there's refraction over the surface of water, because water is cool and cool air bends light down, it bends the light around the lake, you can see across the lake. And I told him you really need to get higher. And I showed him some pictures of mountains where you've got a 10,000 foot high mountain and 9,500 feet of it is behind the curve, which is a very, very difficult thing to explain in the flat Earth model. Now, of course, they'll say things like it's perspective or it's atmospheric refraction, but it doesn't really work. And in fact, in my talk, I devoted quite a large section of my talk to explaining perspective, explaining how perspective works. People think of perspective in terms of what you learn in art class with vanishing points and things getting smaller in like regular intervals as they go down the road, so you can draw lines along the tops of things like light posts, and you get these vanishing points at the end of the road on the horizon. But that's actually really a simplification, and that's part to do with what I was talking about with these simple models versus complex models. Perspective is actually that things get smaller inversely proportional to their distance. So if something's twice as far away, it's half the size. Something's 5 times away, it's 1/5 the size. And it's slightly more complicated than that, really, but that's the basics of it. And that's actually the better model to use. The perspective thing is just tricks for artists. And so if you actually use the real model of perspective, and I showed some interesting diagrams of perspective machines that were used back in the 1500s by artists to do perspective drawings of things, and they used lines of sight intersecting with an image plane that they then used to record the positions of things. It's fascinating stuff. You can look up perspective machines if you're interested. And I explained how this was essentially the same as a camera, and it's the same as 3D graphics and computers, and it's the same as the human eye. It's all the same. It's all to do with lines of sight. So if there's a line of sight between your eye or your camera and an object, then you can see it. So you've got these mountains that if it was a flat Earth, you would have a line of sight between you and the bottom of the mountain and the middle of the mountain and the top of the mountain, and yet you can only see the very peak of it, just peeking over the horizon, just like a few hundred feet when it's a several thousand-foot high mountain. So it's a very difficult thing for them to explain, and I was kind of getting into a lot of detail with this with Joe, and we had a good conversation, and I think I gave him something to think about. He bought me a beer, and I gave him a copy of my book, and we parted as friends, and hopefully he'll see this, and maybe, hey Joe, if you're out there, get in touch with me. Maybe you'd like to be on my podcast. Talked to a few other people. There's a variety of people there. One guy kept asking me why we can't see photographs of upside down buildings, which is an interesting question because it's not really a sensible question. It kind of sounds like a sensible question, but in space there's no really up and down. If you look at pictures of buildings in Australia, and they're upside down, that's just because someone's turned the camera so the horizon is at the top of the image rather than the horizon being at the bottom of the image. It just depends on which way you orient your camera. And I was trying to explain this to him, but it wasn't really getting across, and he kept asking about why aren't there pictures from space of upside down buildings? And really the answer is that when people take photos of things from space, they turn the camera so that up is going into space and down is going down to the ground. And I tried to explain this to him, and I showed him a few pictures taken from the space station, but I don't think he was convinced. He seems to be a fan of the infinite plane society and the everything is fake model, and I think he was very caught up in this particular piece of evidence of his. I think I've seen him post online, and he's constantly posting these pictures of a ship upside down on the bottom of the Earth and saying, look how silly this is, this ship would fall off the Earth, which of course is using the wrong model of gravity. It's using the gravity always goes down towards the bottom of the picture model, when of course gravity actually goes towards the center of the Earth, and in which case the ship being upside down works just fine. So talked to him for a while. Talked to another guy called Nathan Gonzalez. I had several conversations with Nathan. He was a very interesting guy. He has done a lot of experiments, which is great. It's great to do experiments, but they're all kind of experiments where you go out to a body of water, like the Salton Sea, and you shine a light across it, either a laser or he used reflected sunlight, which is a very good thing. It's kind of like a laser beam in a way. It's just very broad beam, not broad, it's a broader but still narrow beam of light which you can flash across a lake. And you have these observations where you have the light source that's fairly low down, you have the camera that's fairly low down, both around say 3 to 6 feet, and you have them separated by 10 miles of water, and they should, if there was no atmosphere, you wouldn't be able to see one from the other. And you can see a flash of light from one side, but so the reason you can see it is again because of refraction. And refraction is at its strongest just over the water, because water is generally colder than air. It cools the air down above it, and that makes the air denser, makes it sink and makes it denser. And light gets bent towards this denser air very, very slightly, but over 10 miles it's quite significant. 10 miles, a few feet in 10 miles is a very, 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 very slight curve, but it's enough to raise something up above the curve of the Earth and make it visible. And I explained this to him, and he was saying he didn't think there was enough refraction, and he didn't really explain what he was seeing. I showed him the picture of the mountain where you've got 10,000 feet missing, or 9,500 feet missing, or whatever. And then he said, oh, well, that's just refraction. Or he said that's perspective and refraction. So that's a bit odd. It doesn't admit that you could, refraction could raise something up a few feet around the curve, but he is fine. I don't remember if he said refraction exactly or if it's more perspective. He's fine with 9,500 feet being hidden by refraction. So it's kind of a little cognitive disconnect there. And I tried to explain things to him, but he kind of rejected my explanations. And I think it's really that he genuinely didn't understand my explanations, which obviously is partly because I'm not doing a very good job explaining it, and I don't really have the visual aids, and I don't have the time to go through in detail and build up things like this is how cameras work, this is how your this is how vision works. I think he missed that section of my talk. So he wasn't understanding what I was saying about how perspective couldn't do this. And Nathan, if you're watching, I apologize if I misrepresent you. I might be conflating some of your positions with other people that I talked to. I talked to so many people. But he said basically that there was an explanation for why all these thousands of feet of mountain was missing, but my explanation of refraction didn't make sense for his observations of a few feet being not missing in terms of being able to see the light. The whole light thing with lasers going over water is complicated, and I made a video, I think it's called Laser Tests Are Misleading. You can look that up on my YouTube channel. So let's see, that's pretty much it for that day, and I kind of went off and did my own thing for the evening. People weren't really that interested in socializing with me, it seemed. But I talked to a lot of people actually at the conference room, but after that I never saw anybody. They were, it was in a hotel, but it was in a casino with like several thousand people, and so I just never saw anybody outside of the actual conference room. Next day was Sunday, the big day, the debate, and this was kind of what the whole conference was promoted as, being this ultimate flat earth debate between Nathan Thompson and Mick West, famous flat earther and flat earther debunker. In the morning, though, the debate was set for 3:30 in the afternoon. In the morning, there was a few more speeches. Mike got up again in the morning. He was the first speaker, Mad Mike, and he gave a long talk on the state of the flat earth community, which is basically him complaining that people weren't taking him seriously, that the other people in the flat earth community was for some reason blowing him off, and that he didn't get invited to the conference, the other conference in Dallas, and so he kind of set up this conference kind of as a response to that. And he went on about this at some length. He also shared a few theories he had, which are kind of similar to the sovereign citizen movement, although he doesn't like that term. But it's things like legalistic, pseudo-legal type things, where you do things like use your name in all lowercase or all uppercase, or you don't capitalize it, and it has a different legal meaning. And he said he had registered the usage of names like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, some various famous people, so they shouldn't legally be able to use it. Stuff that really doesn't make sense from a practical legal point of view. It's, I think he has an argument as to why this is true, but when you actually go to court, obviously the judge is going to say, well, Mark Zuckerberg is just fine using his name, so stop bothering us. And then he gave a little bit of a talk about going into space and how he thought you really need, people don't trust what other people tell them, so they have to see for their own eyes, or see via someone who they trust. So he's going to go up, see the curve of the Earth, come back and tell us, and he'll have cameras showing what everybody else is seeing. Then his rocket guy, his rocket scientist guy, Waldo, got up. Waldo Strakes, I think his name is. Check the show notes. I'll put it in there. He got up and gave a long, detailed explanation of how the rocket was going to work, and it's basically just, a liquid fuel rocket, I believe. Yeah, I think it's liquid fuel. And he's in a little capsule in the end, and there's a balloon, and the balloon takes him up part way, then the rocket goes up the rest of the way. It looked very dangerous. I think, Mad Mike, if he actually does this, stands a good chance of dying if he does it, because it's a very, very dangerous looking thing. He's got an amateur rocket maker building a rocket. I'm sure Waldo has a very high opinion of his own abilities, and he did actually get a rocket to go several hundred feet up in the air. But he's talking about sending a rocket up above breathable atmosphere into a position where it would take several minutes to fall back down. So it's got to not explode, it's got to not leak, it's got to go up and not fly down into the ground. It's got his oxygen supply has got to work, his heating has to work because it's pretty cold up there. everything has to go to plan, and then the parachute has to work coming back down again. He gave an amusing anecdote with a previous rocket where he said when the parachute opened, it was going at, I think, 300 miles an hour, and the parachute was only rated for 100 miles an hour. So it was 3 times over the rating, and they gave a good laugh about that. But obviously, if it hadn't worked, Mad Mike would have died. So it all seems a bit dangerous. And again, this Waldo guy doesn't really seem to think the Earth is flat. Then there was a talk by Shelley. Shelley was the lady who opened the conference with Russ the previous day. And she runs this flat Earth radio thing, rabbit hole, down the rabbit hole. She gave a talk about the forest fires in California, and specifically the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, quite close to where I live. I'm just about 80 miles from there, as the crow flies. So it's something I've been very interested in, and I was fascinated to hear her talk on the topic, because I've given talks, well, a talk on the topic to a skeptic organization, and I've written many articles about it, and I've talked about it in various other people's podcasts, so I knew a lot about it. And she basically just went over the usual kind of conspiracy points, like why is the house burnt but a tree next to it hasn't burnt? Why is the glass melted in this car if the melting temperature of glass is higher than the burning temperature of a fire? Why are these wheels melted? And things like that. Just why aren't the garbage cans that are in the road all melted when a house nearby has fallen down? I tried to not to get too distracted by this, because I was going to give my talk later, and so I didn't want to get distracted. But I did ask her one question, because she kept pointing to the glass in the car melting, and she said glass melts at 2700 degrees or something, and fires burn at 11 or 1200 degrees. And I looked it up while she was there, and I asked her a question. I said, well, two things. Glass doesn't melt in a microwave, because she was saying that there was a microwaves from space, basically, because they were affecting metal more than plastic. Glass doesn't melt in a microwave, and the softening point of glass at which it sags is 1100 degrees. And she kind of just blew that point off, but really it took a good chunk of her evidence away, because she was showing all these windscreens that are basically slumped and shattered, and they weren't melted. They're just kind of slumped down, and they've folded over what was below them. And generally, windscreens usually shatter because of thermal expansion. I told her this, and she just kind of moved on to other things and didn't really answer it. Just kind of ignored the point. So. Right, so let's see. That day, other people gave talks. Brother Ernest gave a talk about how the Earth was a kind of a ball which we're on the inside of. I missed that one. Dave Gordon gave an explanation of his rocket stove, I think, and then talked about something called the Medicine Man. Didn't really see that one. And a very interesting talk was Mike from Exploring Again. He has this scheme where he wants to go to the South Pole. He wants to fly to the South Pole and then ski south from it using a ski sail, where you get this big sail, like kind of paragliding type thing, where you have the wind pull you along whilst you stand on skis. This was all very odd for a number of reasons. First of all, they don't really think that the South Pole exists. And, I think he was kind of giving the standard explanation there that the South Pole is a big ring around the flat Earth. And so anywhere on the ring on the outside is the South Pole. But he was also of the opinion that you can take a flight to the South Pole, which doesn't really make any sense, because everybody else thinks that the South Pole is off limits because of the Antarctic Treaty, and that you're not allowed to go there. And he gets very angry when people bring this up and start saying, that's not true, you don't know that, you haven't been there, and there are these flights to go to the South Pole. He still thinks the Earth is flat, but he thinks the South Pole is the edge of the Earth, and that you can go beyond it. And he has this kind of romantic notion of exploring, which is why his organization is called Exploring Again, where I think he really likes the idea of going out and discovering things. And so he thinks that he will go to the South Pole and get on his skis, and the wind will blow him further south, which is further out from the middle of the disk. and he will explore what's there and report back. Someone asked him, do you think there's a chance of you dying on this trip? And he says, yes, but I'm just doing what the Creator set me on the path of doing. Everyone seemed very much in favor of this, but the problem is that you go to the South Pole and you try to go south. Of course, what's going to happen is every direction from the South Pole is actually north, so you're just going in a random direction in Antarctica. But I don't think he really had done kite skiing before, and he didn't look like the fittest guy in the world. I don't want to bag on him, but just from a practical basis, he seems like he was kind of overweight and unfit, and didn't really seem that familiar with the practicality of kite surfing across the continent. And yet he was a sponsor of this conference, and obviously he'd kind of paid essentially to be there by sponsoring the conference. And he got up and gave his speech, and he said he'd never given a speech before, and he gave a reasonable job for someone who'd never given a speech before. He just kind of read from his notes, and he was a very nice guy, but his scheme is entirely impractical, entirely implausible, and I think quite dangerous. Probably what would happen if he actually goes to the South Pole is that the people there are going to recognize that he's not got a good plan, and they're going to just stop him. It might become clearer to him as the time gets closer what the problems with his plan are, but I'm hoping he doesn't actually try to do it, because it's not going to go well. A much more sensible option would be to charter a plane to fly to the South Pole and then fly south. Get someone who can fly a bit further. But of course, like I say, when you get to the South Pole, every direction is north, so you're just going to see more of Antarctica. But you'll see a lot more of it than you would from trying to have a kite pull you on skis. To the main event, my debate with Nathan Thompson. The debate was just us both sat at a table. What I thought was going to happen, we're going to have 15 minutes each. But what happened was they gave Nathan 15 minutes and then me 10 minutes, and I didn't realize this, but we'll get to that later. So, coin toss at the start. Nathan won the coin toss and elected to go first. And he basically just gave a long list of points of proof as to why the globe doesn't work and why the Earth is flat. Much of which he did yesterday, and I made a list of it, and I marked off the ones that he said. I think about 10 of them were points that he'd made the previous day. And he didn't really address very many of my points that I'd made from the previous day. So I'd made a list of points that I'd made the previous day that I was going to bring up again and see how he actually responded to them. So he gave his 15 minutes of talking, and it went over to me. And so I just basically started out explaining why all of these points one at a time were wrong. And I made a list of 20 points that he had made. Things like pilots not adjusting for the curve, we've got the thermosphere being too hot for satellites, using a laser to measure the temperature of moonlight, photos of the sun not looking very good, various documents that he had looked at that seemed to say that the government thought the Earth was flat, Neil deGrasse Tyson saying that it's flat, the NASA saying that things were photoshopped, and basically I went through all of these things and I gave the actual explanation for them. I told him quite clearly that one of his big pieces of evidence, these flickering images of stars that he was showing, were just his camera being out of focus, which lots of people have told him. And I kind of hammered this point because I knew it wasn't getting through to him. Your camera's out of focus, you've got to learn how to focus. It's shimmering because it's out of focus. And hopefully he will actually learn at some point how to focus his camera and take actual pictures of stars which look like points of light rather than these shimmering blobs which you think are some kind of, ethereal beings. I went through the points I'd made that he didn't bring up and reiterated them and said you didn't bring them. But at this point, I thought I had 5 minutes left, and then Mad Mike was telling me my time was up, so I just had to kind of rush through them really quickly. And then they gave Nathan 10 minutes, and then after that they gave me 15 minutes. So it was a little confusing, as I didn't have things set right, but it actually went very, very well from my perspective. We went back and forth a little bit. Well, I guess we just did those four talks, and I kind of closed with the point that they don't have an actual map of the flat Earth that works. They don't have a scientific model of the flat Earth that works, that actually can make predictions. And we do have a very good one with the globe Earth model that makes perfect predictions. Things like, where it is night and day on the globe Earth makes perfect sense. It's just a globe cut in half by the sun's light, whereas on the flat Earth it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I talked about, as closing, I had a T-shirt on that had a famous experiment by Alfred Russel Wallis from the 1800s. And it was an experiment where he had the entire line of sight was 15 feet above the water to get above refraction. So I stood up and I ripped off my jacket and I pointed up my T-shirt and I explained to them what the experiment was, and I said, rise up, rise above refraction. You've got to rise above refraction. Repeated this because I wanted to get the point across. And that was kind of the end of my talk. You've got to do experiments that rise above refraction, use mountains, use observations that are above the water and not actually touching the water, because water messes you up. And there are lots of explanations you can do. And I was going to go on about talking about various other things, but kind of ran out of time. And one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly in my presentation was just how friendly everybody was and how nice everybody was and how it was actually possible to have good communication with people. And this is something I genuinely believe, and I had a good time there. But anyway, I mentioned the prism thing again, and I showed the prism thing. I told Nathan he was wrong with the prism, and he just smiled and shook his head. After it was over, there was a bunch of questions from the audience. And I think there was more questions for me than were for Nathan, because obviously I'm more of a exotic creature at a flat Earth conference, because I'm not a flat earther, whereas Nathan is. So they asked me questions like, how do you explain various things? Like, why after 6 months does the Earth still face the sun at noon? And I explained the difference between sidereal day and a solar day, which you can look up if you're interested. And there's some other things like I think Nathan Gonzalez asked me about why you can see so far over water with laser experiments, why I made certain changes to my curve calculator, and then I just explained everything. Somebody asked me how I came to flat Earth. It's a question for both of us, and I told them I came to flat Earth the way that a lot of them said they did, which was I started out trying to debunk flat Earth. And unlike them, I did debunk flat Earth. So they all had this origin story where I started out trying to debunk flat Earth, and then I couldn't, and now I'm a flat earther. Whereas my origin story with regards to flat Earth was I started out trying to debunk flat Earth, and I did. And here are all the reasons why it's debunked. After the debate, I had a bunch of very interesting conversations. Now, there's one woman that I talked to quite extensively for maybe, I don't know, at least half an hour. And she didn't want her name to go out, so I'm going to call her Laura. Laura was fascinating, flat earther. I think friend of Nathan Gonzalez, or at least knows him. And she's been part of these experiments where you shine lights across the water. And I was trying to explain to her why it doesn't work. And we talked about all kinds of topics. It was very interesting. I'm hoping to have Laura on my podcast at some point, maybe even later today. And it was very interesting talking to her, because I was explaining things in what I thought were fairly straightforward ways from my point of view. Like I was trying to explain why perspective can't actually hide the bottom of a mountain. And she wasn't getting it, which again, is obviously partly due to me not being able to explain things very well. But it's also, I think, due to her thinking about things in a certain way, which isn't conducive to accepting these different explanations, because she's been thinking about things in a certain way for so long. She thinks that she knows that perspective can hide the bottom of mountains, because that's what perspective does. It makes things smaller and they vanish. So it's very interesting, essentially getting her perspective on what I am saying. Like her not understanding things directly. It's very different talking to a person in person than it is talking to them online. So that was fascinating. I talked to a few other people after that. I talked more with Nathan Gonzalez, and he gave me some photographs of Catalina Island that he'd taken. And I actually after I got back, I did a little explainer video explaining how his photographs actually show that the bottom 2/3 of Catalina Island is missing. And he was saying, when he showed me these photos, that you can see more than you should. But it'd be interesting to see how he responds. He's not actually got back to me yet. And Nathan, I think, is someone I would like to also maybe have on my podcast, because he's a fascinating character. He has a YouTube channel called Bipolar Flat Earth, and he has some other YouTube things going on. And he goes out and does his experiments, which is great. And I explained to him in some detail how you need to get a rise up above refraction, and that the center point of the line of sight also needs to be above the water. So you need to have something in the middle that's above the water, or you need to look at things that are high, like mountains and things like that. Anyway, I gave him all these explanations of it, which was quite fascinating, trying to get that across, and him disagreeing with me quite emphatically. He also disagreed with me on my take on the forest fires, the wildfires. But that's kind of another topic. If you can't convince people that the Earth is round, then there's not that much point in talking to them about forest fires. Or maybe there is, I don't know. So, what did I take away from the conference? I think ultimately the most interesting aspect for me was that the misunderstandings of things seem entirely genuine. Pretty much everyone I talked to seemed very honest and straightforward. Even Nathan Thompson, who people portray as being someone who lies and misleads, he came across as being a nice guy who was being relatively honest with what he said. And I think in most cases he genuinely did not understand the issues. I was trying to explain to him why satellites don't burn up in the thermosphere if the thermosphere is 2,000 degrees. And it's because the thermosphere is very, very, very thin. And so the main heat factors are actually radiation, which is incoming radiation from the sun and outgoing radiation from the satellites. The thermosphere has pretty much nothing to do with it. And he didn't understand it. He did not get this distinction between heat from conduction from the gases of the thermosphere and heat from radiation and radiation, outgoing radiation. He was thinking things only cool down via the air touching them. Where, of course, if you put something in a vacuum, it will still cool down via radiation. And if you put something in the sun, it'll eventually reach a thermal equilibrium. It won't actually get hotter and hotter and hotter. It'll get to a point at which the heat is radiating away from it at a certain rate. On Earth, it's conducting as well. Anyway, getting into the weeds there, but the point is that these misunderstandings that they had are genuine. When people are saying things like, why can't we see photos of upside down buildings, it sounds like they're trolling. But it seemed to me like the guy really didn't understand why we don't have photos of upside down buildings. He didn't get the spatial relationships of things and how it relates to gravity pointing down. And when I talked to Laura about perspective, she didn't really understand why there's a difference between the perspective of the surface of something like the ocean surface and the perspective of something that's vertical, like a mountain or a building. And I was taking photos and trying to demonstrate this to her, but she genuinely wasn't getting it. And Nathan, I think, also wasn't getting why his explanations for the missing bottom part of a mountain really didn't make any sense, especially in the context of him saying that he made these accurate observations across water, which were only a few feet with the issue, and yet there are thousands of feet in these mountain issues. And everyone, for the large part, seemed quite nice and very polite and very friendly. I had a good time. We were joking with people. Brother Ernest was a lot of fun. He gave me this free t-shirt. And I handed out a bunch of copies of my book. I usually sell my book at conferences, but it didn't seem like the right type of thing to be seen making a profit. Not that I do make a profit from these books, with the cost of actually taking them there. But I just gave away a bunch of copies of my book. I gave one to Waldo, the rocket scientist guy, and he emailed me later and asked if I was a member of the CIA, because he thought it was very suspicious that I was debunking chemtrails and 9/11, which is an unfortunate thing. in that, I debunk flat Earth, but I also debunk 9/11. I also debunk chemtrails. I debunk all kinds of conspiracy theories, and they think these conspiracy theories are way more reasonable than they're way more plausible than the flat Earth conspiracy theory. So I think it kind of ruins me a little bit in their eyes. They see me as someone who debunks everything, and they don't listen to what I say about flat Earth. But I came away, I think, with some hope for the future. I think it does demonstrate that you can communicate with people who have very alternative viewpoints. We all have common things. If you even just start with something like, we both like beer, you can start out with a common thing and you can talk about that. You can talk about things like, if you take a photograph of something, you see a certain viewpoint. This is something we agree upon. And then we figure out what we disagree about. And then we try to figure out why we disagree. And then you figure out, are there things that we can do to resolve this difference? And I think with Nathan Gonzalez, I gave him an experiment to do, the Wallis Experiment, which should resolve the fact that he's seeing these lines of sight, these lasers, close to the water because of refraction. If you rise up above refraction, you see a different thing. Nathan Thompson actually on Facebook told me that the prism thing, the green flash thing, had given him something to think about, and he was doing some experiments to try to figure it out. And so he actually, I think, recognized that what he was claiming was actually wrong. Now, I anticipate he will probably come up with an explanation for what he is seeing that fits the flat Earth model, but he was previously giving this proof of the flat Earth from green flashes. I showed him he was doing it upside down. Now he has to revise his worldview one way or another. He's obviously not going to go and drop the flat Earth thing, but he can't use that anymore. I showed him some other thing as well, some table he was using, which he said proves the flat Earth, actually describes the curve of the Earth plus refraction. So that's another thing that I kind of repeated to him to explain to him that it's wrong, and maybe he's going to have to revise his worldview on that a little bit. So it's kind of baby steps. But the key is having effective communication with people. If I wasn't actually there talking to Nathan about the green flash, I think he would just have ignored everything that I posted online about it. But I actually went there. I gave him a prism, one that I actually ground down one edge and spray painted it black to make it easier to use. So I put in quite a bit of effort, and he appreciated that. And he appreciated me talking to him and being polite, and we had good conversations. He was adamant that I was wrong, and I was, adamant that he was wrong, was making mistakes. But we had conversations, and I think because of that, ultimately, some progress was made. I think it perhaps gives some insight into other conspiracy theories, in that the flat Earth people had these genuine misunderstandings of things, and I think with things like chemtrails and 9/11, people also have these genuine misunderstandings of the physics that are involved and the science that's involved, and they don't realize this, and it's hard to communicate. And you can't just say, oh no, that's wrong. You have to kind of get past this misunderstanding. You have to resolve this misunderstanding and you create an actual genuine understanding of what's going on. And so ultimately, I think a message of hope from the Flat Earth Conference. We can talk to each other, and we should talk to each other, and I'm going to continue to talk to people. Follow-ups are, I have done my video with Nathan Gonzalez's footage, and I'm waiting to hear back from him on that. I'm going to try to talk to Laura, trying to schedule a podcast with her. And the debate itself, this is a strange thing, the debate was recorded. But since that happened, since the actual debate happened over the weekend, I've heard nothing at all about it. No indication, no one's talking about having watched it. And IPS, who I think is in charge of the recordings, hasn't mentioned it and has just moved on to talking about false events. Like there was a guy who set himself on fire outside the White House, and he's discussing if that's real or fake. And he's not talking about the Flat Earth Conference. It's almost like they want it to go away. So I'd really like to see the video of my debate out there. And I'm not sure why it's not out there yet. Perhaps it will be out there later. There were other people filming there for documentaries, but they're only going to put out parts of the debate. So I'd really like to see the full footage of the debate, and I'm not sure why it hasn't come out yet. Hopefully it will come out in the future. I didn't record anything myself, again, because I didn't want people to think they were under some kind of surveillance or something like that. So I just took notes, and hopefully this 1 hour of my recounting that is a good sense of what happened. But really, it would be great to see the footage of the debate so that people can judge for themselves whether my account is accurate and whether the Earth is flat or not. Okay, I will keep everyone updated. Check the show notes for names and whatnot. And that's Tales from the Rabbit Hole.